Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Death and the afterlife have fascinated humans for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians had some of the most fascinating and intricate views on the afterlife, so much so that they built their entire way of life around preparing for what came next. Their beliefs shaped everything from daily routines to elaborate burial rituals, and even today, we're still uncovering the depth of their understanding of death, grief, and legacy. I'm so excited to have Julie Scott, the executive director from the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, with us today to talk about these traditions. We'll discuss what the ancient Egyptians thought happened to the soul after death, how mummification was more than just preserving the body, and how funeral practices varied depending on social class. And of course, we'll explore what we can take from their wisdom when thinking about our own relationship with loss and remembrance. So grab a warm drink, find a comfortable seat, and join us for the conversation. Julie, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Traci.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your journey to the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum and your role?
Yes, I found out about the Rosicrucian Order many years ago from a friend who behaved in ways that really inspired me. And I saw her once in a very challenging situation, and she was just very calm and collected. And I said, "How do you do this?" And she said, "Have you ever heard of the Rosicrucians?" And I had not. And eventually, she shared some information about the Rosicrucian Order, and I immediately joined. And it's the Rosicrucian Order is a philosophical organization that introduces us to laws in the universe so that we can live in harmony with them. And it's just a way of getting in the flow of things rather than being unaware and then kind of fighting the natural flow.
So I'm curious about that. How are they related to ancient Egypt? And I know, or I've heard, maybe not know, but I've heard that the philosophy takes from several different philosophies.
Yes. So the lessons that Rosicrucians study today come from a very long tradition that is typically called the Western esoteric tradition. And it's not a religion, it's these are meditations and exercises and practices that are shared so that we come up with our own philosophy of life. And many of the practices that Rosicrucians today do, and a lot of the philosophy, is based on what was practiced in ancient Egypt. And then later, the Greeks and then the Romans came and they incorporated the ancient Egyptian beliefs with their system, and this was passed on more or less underground over several millennia because there might be a predominant religion that wouldn't allow these other traditions to exist. So at different times, this understanding of natural laws, this experience of the universe rather than someone else telling you about it would have to be more or less discreet in order to continue. And Rosicrucians study some of these practices and beliefs from ancient Egypt. We also have a degree of study where we learn about the ancient Greek philosophers and alchemy and Kabbalah. So these different traditions that passed along the wisdom of the ancient mystery schools have contributed to what Rosicrucians study today. Plus, we study the latest information on healing and health and science and the nature of consciousness.
Very interesting. How many Rosicrucians are there about in the world? Do you know?
Well, there are tens of thousands of Rosicrucians worldwide.
I'm interested in learning more, but let's turn to the museum itself. What is the mission of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum and what makes it unique compared to other museums that focus on ancient Egypt?
Our primary goal is for people to feel the connection that we have with people from other cultures and other times. And by experiencing that, it leads to better understanding, and that eventually leads to peace in the world. So it's our contribution to sharing the similarities that people have over time and locations so that we can see how much we have in common with other people and how we're all really from the same source and connected.
Ancient Egyptians had a deeply spiritual view of death. Can you walk us through their beliefs and about the afterlife and the journey of the soul?
The ancient Egyptians had a very sophisticated belief system about the nature of the soul, about the afterlife. They believed that there were either 8 or 9 different aspects of the soul. And we've heard of a number of these. They're pretty common knowledge. There's the Ka, which is the life force, and it's our spiritual double, and it requires sustenance in the afterlife. And then there's the Ba, which is the part of the soul associated with our personality, and it's kind of our essence. When it's the energy that we bring with us. And then there is the Ak, AKH, which is when these two and all the other aspects of the soul also come together to create a spiritually regenerated being. And the ancient Egyptians believed that what we did in this life affected our experience in the afterlife. So everything they did in this life was preparing them for what would happen in the spiritual realm.
And so that, of course, translated to the day-to-day life, everything that they did.
The ancient Egyptians believed that after their physical body died, that they would pass in front of a group of deities who would ask them questions. And their answer to each question had to be no. It's called the negative confession. And first they'd be asked a question that was kind of easy to answer, like, have you ever stolen anything? Or have you ever eavesdropped? And then these questions would get harder, where it would be, have you ever caused anyone to weep? Have you ever denied a hungry person food? And if they didn't answer, no, I've never done that, they couldn't pass to the next step in the process of traveling to the afterlife, which was to stand before a big balance, a big scale. And on one side of the scale is their heart, meaning basically all of their actions and who they are. And on the other side is what's called the feather of truth. And there was a deity named Maat, M-A-A-T, and she is the deity of a number of things, including order, like the opposite of chaos. So every Egyptian knew that they were going to be judged on, had they lived a life that contributed to order in the world, or did their energy and their actions contribute to chaos in the world? So if the scales balanced, then they were able to go on to the final step, which was a place that it's called the Duat, D-U-A-T or D-W-A-T, and it is the field of pure potential. Anything that exists in the world came from the pure potential of the Duat. And it is probably what we would describe as paradise. So it's where everything is in perfect harmony. And you had to have lived a harmonious life to be able to go there in the afterlife.
Now, was there a certain age, or is this as adults are asked questions in many religions? I was raised Jewish, so we don't believe that you're an adult until you're 13. And so there are certain leniencies that were given. The questions that you asked, have you ever stolen anything? Well, many children have, then they get in trouble and they never do it again. So, I mean, that's a pretty intense list you have there. What happens? I mean, is there some leniency for intent and for becoming a better human being?
That's a great question. There is no cutoff of an age that I've ever heard of, so I'm not aware of, you haven't had time yet to learn that this is how you should behave. However, they do have a little safety mechanism. In every tomb, there is this image that shows the scales of judgment. And again, it has our heart, and the other side is the feather of truth of the deity Mot. And there is a deity there taking notes, watching everything that's happening, recording everything. And this is Thoth, who is the keeper of the mysteries and the keeper of wisdom. And he's often depicted as an ibis bird or sometimes as a baboon, but he's right there recording everything. And there is a conductor who is walking the deceased person in the images on the wall of the tomb, walking that person hopefully to make it all the way to the final judgment. And this is the deity Anubis, who is a jackal-headed deity. And Anubis is there looking out for the deceased person. Anubis is the conductor through this process and also through the initiations that they held. So on the scales, you see the two sides, and right in the middle, there is a double of Anubis, and he is just pushing the weights a little bit in case, maybe you did tell that one lie, or maybe you eavesdropped that one time. So there is a little fail-safe there with Anubis helping you out.
Well, that's great. Yeah, all of us need a little bit of help.
We do need that. Also, in the person's body was mummified so that it would be preserved, because an aspect of the soul was believed to need the body to live on in the afterlife. And then that was covered in linen. And in certain periods of time, little cheat sheets were found stuck in the linen with answers that would say something like, if you're asked, have you ever eavesdropped? Say no. So they're found in mummies thousands of years later, found in the linen wrappings. They would find these little notes from the Book of the Dead, which the better translation of that book is the Book of Coming Forth by the Light. And it's really supporting the person on making it into the Duat, into the afterlife, into the light.
So mummification is, I think, the most well-known aspect of ancient Egyptian death practices. I think many of us grew up going to the museums and seeing mummies, and so it was a spiritual practice, but there was a lot more, so there was a lot more to it than just the preservation or the ritual of the body. There was this real spiritual aspect.
It's astonishing how sophisticated the ancient Egyptians' belief system was. And it changed over years. I mean, we're talking about several thousand years of Egyptian history. And they were, a lot of people have the impression that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, and that this was something like they were afraid of death, or they were focusing too much on people who had passed on. But this was really a very positive way of viewing eternal life. So when we pass on, it's just another step in the eternal process of life.
And you talk about the different dynasties and or the different time periods and how the death care practices changed. I remember going to the museum and seeing at the very beginning how simple the burials were, where it was just, a person that was, very similar to ours. And then it got a lot more, as you said, sophisticated. Was that because of the religion itself was changing and morphing into something a little bit more? Is there a reason why that occurred, you think?
It occurred because of increased wealth of some individuals. So again, the bottom line was to preserve the body so that an aspect of the soul had some place to go back to. So at first, individuals were just placed in a fetal position and placed in the sun, which naturally dried the body out. And then something similar happened, but the deceased person's body was placed in a wooden box, and the wooden box was placed in the sand. And we have one of those very old sarcophagi. That's a wooden box that their body would have been placed in that. And then as people had more resources, they wanted to be surrounded with things that they wanted to use in the afterlife. And eventually it became so elaborate that they would have at first an offering chamber where they expected their family members to come and leave food and drink offerings for them to use in the afterlife. And then there would be a burial chamber where the person's mummified body was placed in a sarcophagus and then placed in maybe a second granite sarcophagus and lowered and covered, and really strongly protecting that body so that it would always be there. And then the tomb would be filled with things that they wanted, up to the point of a pharaoh's tomb with, I don't know if you've ever seen photos of King Tut's tomb that was found with the items for his afterlife in there. It was, every single inch was packed with things that would have been used in the afterlife. So it went from just making sure that the body dried out to everything you might possibly need in the afterlife to have the best afterlife possible.
And do they have people taking and watching over the body, especially, of course, at the beginning when they were just lying out? They didn't want any animal or anyone or anything to get to the body. But did they continue that where they had people watching the body, being with the body, sitting with the body to ensure that this person got to, to help them to the afterlife? And if they did, how long? Do you know how long that?
Yeah, so it was 70 days. The process would take 70 days, and it included, it was done outside of town. So the priests who had this duty were they were not part of the main community. They were kept separate, and they were reciting prayers over the deceased person's body that whole time. And they washed the body, and they prepared it with different wines that help preserve the body. And then they packed the body with a substance that's called natron, and it's like salt and baking soda. It's a natural substance that dries the body out. And all this time, this was a very sacred practice. It wasn't these priests were held in very high regard and were protecting the deceased people. And the tombs too took a long time to build. There are some tombs that let's say a pharaoh died unexpectedly, because they may plan for 30 years to build their tomb, and maybe they died unexpectedly. So there were times when a pharaoh would take someone else's tomb and they would chisel off the other person's name, and they would have the tomb. So these were elaborate processes. And then for like, there are this was it became much more elaborate and involved, because like the Book of the Dead or the Book of the Coming Forth by Light, that didn't exist all the time. As that developed, it required more steps and procedures to help you, like a guidebook to get your soul to the afterlife.
Now, do the Rosicrucians actually believe in all of these gods, or is it okay?
No, what we value from the ancient mystery schools is first of all, not going through somebody else to experience, to have a relationship with the divine or our inner self, that you go within, and to look at the world around you to better understand what's going on. So those are the main things. And like with the deities, that's what the ancient Egyptians were doing. They were personifying or they were connecting an animal's traits with the energy that they wanted to connect with. So whether it was healing or courage or love or joy, they wanted to make it easier for people to relate to that. So maybe it's a fierce lioness, or falcon, whatever it is, just to make it easier for humans to relate to.
Is there a difference in how funeral rituals occur depending on social class?
Yes, there was a difference based on social class and on wealth. And every Egyptian believed that they could make it to the afterlife, that if they did things right, they could make it to the afterlife. Wealthy people wanted just to put the odds more in their favor, and they would sometimes hire mourners, and this would show like that this person was really led such a good life that they would be missed. There is a tomb it's called the Valley of the Workmen, that shows women mourning. If they hired mourners, it would be women. And sometimes they would be shown putting their hair over their face. And some cultures do that even today. And the understanding is that some people believe that that the hair carries the energy and memories of the deceased person, and that either like cutting your hair or moving it around helps the release of this energy and helps the healing process. They would also throw dirt on themselves. They pick up sand and throw it on themselves, and they would wear dark clothing. So there are some examples where a tomb will show mourners with tears and doing these different activities. And the professional mourners definitely were only for wealthy families. And often there would be two women who would play the role of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. And they were two sisters. And when another deity, Osiris, died, they helped with his resurrection. So by having those two goddesses there, and they're not mourning, they're as powerful figures keeping an eye on things, that it helps with the regeneration of the soul of the deceased person.
Were there other mourning or grieving practices that took place, not only right after, you just talked about the funeral procession but were there other rituals or other length of time that people mourned that was significant?
A tomb owner would expect that their family would come for the rest of their lives, would come to the tomb, would make offerings of food and drink and incense to sustain the ka of this aspect of the soul of the deceased person. And many tombs have, it's called a false door, when tombs typically have the same layout. And there is an offering chamber, and there is, it looks like a door on the wall, but it's not really a door. And the family members would leave food and drink and incense at this door, and it was believed that the ka would come in through this door through a magical process and take the food and drink. And then in tombs, they would draw those objects on the wall, knowing either that the family members wouldn't live forever, but also if the family members didn't come through, this is still carved or painted on the walls, and the deceased person, the ka, could use that. Mm. They even had a statue. If you go from the offering chamber and then you go down to the burial chamber where the mummified person's where the person's mummified body is, there's often a statue there so that if the mummified body didn't make it, the ka could live in that statue, which was symbolic of the deceased person. So the whole point of all of this was that the ka, this aspect of the soul, would have some place to live on in.
Mm. Now, I know in Western culture, one part of grieving, I think in everyone's culture, one part of grieving is figuring out that relationship, how it's changed with the person who has died. How are you going to carry on that relationship? One of the healthy things that we do is that continuation of that relationship. Did families in ancient Egypt do stuff besides, I know you just talked about the ritual, but in their day-to-day life, how did they maintain that relationship with their ancestors?
There's not a lot of information that survived, because the tombs survive because they're made of stone, and there are limited texts that are available. Plus, the book of the Coming Forth by Day is written on some tombs, so you have that available. But there isn't a lot of information about ways that they perpetuated the memory of the person who has passed on. It was very important that the surviving family members came to the tomb, and in that way, their visits perpetuated that. But there isn't a lot of other information on how they may have grieved in their everyday life. It may have existed, it just hasn't survived. That information hasn't survived.
What do you think that we could learn from the way ancient Egyptians viewed death and the afterlife that might help us in our modern understanding of loss?
The ancient Egyptians saw death as just a very natural part in the long cycle of life. So it just was a natural part of what continues on. And they valued the possibility of living in the spiritual realm where everything existed in an unmanifested state and could be manifested by living a life that we would probably call guided by their ethics and their values. And they also believed that they had an idea of where this magical realm was, the Duat, when the ancient Egyptians believed that the sky was feminine and earth was masculine. Mm. And the sky they saw as a goddess who they called Nut, N-U-T, Nut. And you see depictions of her where she has her arms and legs outstretched and she is protecting everybody on earth. And she has stars on her clothing, on her body. And the ancient Egyptians believed that what we could see of those stars, when we look up and we see the stars, on the other side is the Duat. That's where it exists. And that there is a star for each of us that protects us. And we will go there in the afterlife.
I remember going down to the tomb. I mentioned the museum because I've been there a bit. And I know that in the tomb that you have, that Newt is part of that it's, she's painted on the ceiling where the tomb actually is. And that's really significant, or was significant.
Yeah, so she's protecting all beings on earth, but also she's protecting the deceased person in the tomb, because in a tomb she'd be in the burial chamber. So she is just above where the sarcophagus is buried, and the deceased person above the person would be the star, their guiding star, their you could call their guardian angel or their protective energy. And there's also Nut, which is the beginning of the realm, the spiritual realm.
What is something that most people misunderstand or misinformed about regarding ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs?
I think there are several things. First, that the Egyptians were obsessed with death and like out of fear, and that does not appear to be the case at all. Also, that a lot of people assume that only pharaohs had an afterlife, that only the pharaoh, because the biggest tombs would be for the pharaohs, and those are the ones that have survived the most. But in reality, all Egyptians believed that they could achieve eternal life if they followed the order of the deity Mot, and if they received proper burial rites. And another, maybe this is even the biggest misconception, is that mummification was just about body preservation, when actually it was a deeply spiritual belief ensuring that the deceased person's soul had a place to live on.
For those interested in learning more, what are some ways in which they can explore these topics further, either through the museum or other resources?
Well, there are a lot of great resources. It's important to find the right resource, though, because when King Tut's tomb was found and other discoveries were made in Egypt 100 years ago, the archaeologists and Egyptologists often, everybody has biases, and the predominant bias was from white European males, no fault of theirs, but they're seeing things and it goes through the filter of their upbringing and their education. So they're seeing, well, this is primitive culture, and they had these superstitious beliefs, and nothing really happened there. Fortunately, some brave souls in the past few decades have made progress in pointing out that really the ancient Egyptians had a deep connection with spirituality. They didn't see either the vast skies or the air around us as empty space. They saw it as energy, that they were beings swimming in this energy. And so it's really important to find a resource that sees the spiritual aspect of the ancient Egyptians' beliefs. And we've made a conscious effort on our website when we present information about the deities and the locations and temples to show more than just a superficial information about the belief systems. And there's a great book called The Shamanic Wisdom of the Pyramid Texts by Jeremy Nadler that presents a really good introduction to the Duat and this magical realm. And so, but just look for some of the standard older books. Just the authors just couldn't make it past their biases, and so it makes the ancient Egyptian belief system just look very dead and silly, where really it was very vibrant. They were very engaged with the world around them, and in many aspects, it's very inspiring.
Well, when I was looking for books on these subjects, there isn't a lot out there. There really is not, and it's unfortunate. It's just the signs of our time, I guess. But there really isn't a lot out there, and we have to do a better job. And there isn't a lot in the local libraries either. I mean, all the stuff you get in the libraries is that really old stuff. So,
well, even and not just with Egyptology, but in other traditions like the mysteries at Eleusis and Delphi in Greece, if someone stepped out of whatever the paradigm was, whatever the leading academic view was, that would be the end of your career. If someone stepped out and said, I think probably the pyramids weren't just used for burying pharaohs, that they could have been used for other purposes. And that when there's talk about spiritual text, it wasn't just meant for the pharaoh after he died. It was meant for initiates in the mystery schools who had experiences on this plane. And there was a Rosicrucian Egyptologist named Max Guillemot, and he wrote a book called The Initiatory Process of Ancient Egypt. And this really was one of the first books that showed that the text and the philosophy of ancient Egypt was more than just symbolic for the pharaoh. Also, another Rosicrucian who was the founder of the Rosicrucian order, H. Spencer Lewis, wrote a book called The Symbolic Prophecy of the Great Pyramid. And this is available for free online on our website, that talks about some of the, it addresses some of the unknowns of how the pyramid was built, and what was going on there. So that's another good resource on ancient Egypt.
And I'll be sure that we put those in the description so that people
Okay.
could find them, and with links out and everything. So thank you. So I know we're almost at the top of the hour. I just want to say is there anything else that you'd like to share that we haven't touched upon?
I think the greatest value of exploring ancient Egyptian spirituality is to understand their perspective of how we are part of an interconnected whole, how we're connected with the divine, how we're connected with the master within us, and how every action we take, every thought we have, every word we speak has an effect in the world and has an effect on our growth as an individual. When we're more aware of the consequences of our thoughts and actions and words, I think it's really valuable in our own personal growth.
I would agree. Julie, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I appreciate everything that you've shared with us. Before we wrap up, can you let our listeners know how they can learn more about the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum?
Yes, our website is egyptianmuseum.org, and we have all kinds of resources available. Also, we have a new AI robot at the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. If you're able to come in person, this robot is in the form of the ancient Egyptian deity Thoth, the keeper of the mysteries, and he can answer questions about the nature of consciousness and ancient Egyptian history. You can ask him any question and receive a thoughtful response.
Interesting. Thank you. Listeners, today's conversation reminds us that how we think about death shapes how we live. The ancient Egyptians had an intricate relationship with the afterlife, not out of fear, but out of a deep respect for the journey beyond. Their rituals, beliefs, and traditions were all about connection. Connection to ancestors, to legacy, and to something greater than themselves. And while our practices may look different today, that longing for remembrance and meaning occurs across time and cultures. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.